My name's Angel Brooks and I have been placed in the position to look at the temporary stabling and ethology of horses at long format events. So during the duration of this video, I'm going to be talking to you about the natural ethology firstly of the horse and how this is important and the behavioural needs need to be met when placed in temporary stabling at long format events. Secondly, we're going to look at the changes that are going to be taking place for these horses and explain why these changes need to take place. Fourthly, we're going to look at global differences, so look at what happens in other countries in comparison to the United Kingdom. And finally, we're going to look at how we're going to monitor these changes and to see if they are effective for the horse. So firstly, we're going to look at the ethology of the horse, which is the focal species when looking at temporary stabling at long format events. So horses naturally live in a herd, which is essentially their family. So they live in family groups and their main relationships in a herd are between mares and offspring. So the groups will be made up mainly of mares and offspring, and there is usually one stallion present who will watch over the group. So they find safety in numbers. They like living in large groups so they're able to avoid predators. And they have also evolved to live on the grass plains and be quite large animals so that they have size in their favour, but also they have evolved so that they can run quite fast. So if predators did attack the herd, then they're able to run away. They also have really strong social orders within their herds, and it often depends on which fillies the stallion favours. So he'll often protect these mares, and the fillies that are bred by their mothers will often be pushed out the group and forced to join another herd or start their own group. So this probably leaves you wondering what happens to colts because there's only one stallion in a group. So colts tend to go off and form what is called a bachelor group. So when they come of age, they leave their mother and they leave the herd, and they'll join these groups which are made up of colts and stallions, and this offers them time to play and mature. So now you have a brief understanding of how horses would live in the wild. We can start to look at how they would actually spend this time in the wild. So we call it the time budgets of horses. So we assess what they do and for how long they do it, essentially. So horses will spend a lot of their day grazing. Whenever you see a horse in a field, they've always got their head down and they're eating. So they probably spend between 10 to 16 hours a day foraging food, and they are adapted to survive off the worst forage possible. So you could put them on a field that looks awful and they would still be fine because this is how their stomachs and digestive systems have evolved for them to survive. And they probably will only take small breaks for resting and sleeping. So we also know that horses spend a lot of their time moving, so locomotive activity is important for them. And when they're grazing, they will constantly be moving and looking for more forage. So in turn, that means they're spending a lot of the time moving around as well. So that's really important when looking at their natural time budgets and how many strides they would naturally cover in a day. So now that you've got an understanding of how horses would naturally spend their time, you can see that when we place them in stables, this is very, very different to what they would do in the wild. So when we're stabling them, we're limiting their access to forage, which they'd often, they'd spend most of their day doing that. We're also limiting their locomotive activity as well as their socialisation with other horses. So now that you've got this understanding, we're going to have a look at the changes that I want to put in place, long-term and short-term changes, and how this will benefit the horses. So we're going to look at why it will be better for the horses at these long format events and how it's going to improve their health as well. So as you can see here, I've added a photo of current temporary stabling. And if you just want to take it in for a second, and then I'll go through my thoughts on it. So as I'm sure you can probably see, it's not the brightest, it's very enclosed, and it doesn't offer much space for the horse. And I also feel that it's restricting them from the world as well, because they can't really see anything. There's no chat hatches, and it just doesn't provide a great environment for horses. This is also a video from the front, just so you can have a feel of what it's like for the horses at long format events with current temporary stabling measures. And this is just the view from the door that the horse would have. Here is a picture of traditional British stabling, just so you can see the difference in the temporary stabling and traditional stabling. So I would argue it's fairly similar, but in traditional stabling, there is more access for horses to see the world. Obviously the stables are sturdier, and there's usually chat hatches inside as well. But I've just put this picture in for comparison. So when we're taking these horses to long format events, we are disrupting their routines. So they'll have a routine that they have at home, and when they're coming to these events, it's going to change again. But I feel the first issue that needs to be addressed is the natural feeding time budgets. So when a horse is home, it probably has access to turnout for multiple hours of the day. But when they come to these long format events and they're stabled for hours and hours and hours upon end, they're losing these natural time budgets. So horses need to naturally constantly be foraging, which we already spoke about in the ethology of the horse. And there are ways around this, which I'm going to discuss in order to benefit their health as well. So when they're stabled, they're not getting the natural diets, which usually consists of rich in fibre and low in starch forage. But instead we're feeding them hay or haylage, which is a lot higher in calories, and it's just not what their digestive system is designed to digest, essentially. So when they're stabled for these long periods, we give them this hay or haylage, but it usually doesn't last them as long as we would like it to. So that's because they need to be eating constantly for their digestive system to work. And often these hay nets that we give them, or haylage on the floor, will only last them about 3 hours, usually 3 to 4 hours tops, which isn't ideal. So to avoid this problem, we need to double up hay nets, so the small hold hay nets, and put them one on top of each other. And actually a study by Ellis et al. Found that this really did increase the hours that they were trickle feeding themselves, especially through the night when we're not there to give them more constant forage. And in doing this, it will help their health, as if they're not eating constantly, it can lead to gastric inflammation, ulcers, and also stereotypic behaviour such as box walking, cribbing, and weaving. So if they've not got access to that constant forage, they can develop anxieties, and it also can lead to health problems. So by doing this, we're going to avoid all these problems, hopefully. In this picture, I've added on the slide, there is chat hatches between stables. So by having chat hatches in the temporary stabling instead of solid walls, it will allow horses to talk to other horses, and it might reduce stereotypy behaviour such as weaving or box walking, because they are able to socialise. But obviously there will be an option to cover the window, and grooms can make that decision based on the individual horse if they have health issues, for example, or if they're worried about them hurting themselves. But at least that option will be available to horses within temporary stabling now. And finally, the last thing I want to do is offer grazing for these horses at these long format events. So obviously they're there over multiple days, and restricted grazing in competition horses has been linked to stereotypic behaviour patterns. So if we can offer them some grazing, it might be possible to avoid these behaviours because the horse is being enriched. So if we offer them grazing for short periods of times at competitions, it will hopefully reduce these behaviours. It will also encourage their locomotive behaviours as well as their natural feeding patterns, and it could potentially help avoid health issues at events such as colic or just from eating their bedding in general. So overall, the health benefits from doing this outweigh the risk of injury or disease. So these are the changes that I want to implement, and I've been influenced to implement these changes from global differences. So personally, I visited the state of Kentucky, Lexington in the USA, and I witnessed round pens outside temporary stabling, which offered horses that period of grazing, even if it was in a small enclosed space, but it offered them that difference of change of scenery and the difference in forage. So I'll attach a picture here so you can see where I saw it. So these were the round pens that I witnessed at Kentucky Horse Park in America, and these pens were placed by the temporary stabling, so owners and grooms had an option to turn their horses out for short periods of time whilst they were being mucked out, for example, and it just offered them a varied change of scenery and different forage as well, and it also just gave them a chance to have a leg stretch without being ridden. The other global difference that I wanted to discuss is stable size. So in Denmark, their stables are 10.2 metres by 5.7. And in comparison, the British Horse Society recommends a 3.6 metre by 3.6 metre stable. So we could look at expanding the stable size because if horses are competing internationally, especially if they go to Denmark, they're going to see this larger stable size. So if we look at implementing this, it's also going to help for stereotypic behaviours such as weaving, box walking, because they've got more space to exhibit their natural behaviour. So I think this is something we could definitely look at doing on a global scale. So finally, we're going to monitor how effective the interventions are by using scientific methods. So the first method I'm going to use is video analysis. So through video analysis, it allows us to observe the horses for long periods of time, and it also allows us to monitor their behaviours and quantify this. So it gives us data to work with. And from this, a behavioural score can also be produced. So we can give horses scores on how relaxed they are in the stable, for example, and we can also tell if they're stressed. So this system would be based on behavioural and psychological measures, and the video analysis would be part of that. Secondly, we're going to use saliva. So anytime the horse is removed from the stable for a husbandry practice, which could include grooming or clipping or tacking up, or just in general taken away from the stable environment, a sample of the saliva is taken, and this can be quantified and compared to the video analysis to work with the behaviour score, but it just gives us a physical data point to look at. So it gives us an idea if they're experiencing a high score or a low score and their stress level, and it will also help us to create a baseline score that you would expect to see in most horses. And finally, heart rate monitors will be used. These are very discreet on the horse. The horse doesn't even notice, but it again gives us a physical indicator of the horse's stress level in the environment. Alongside this, the horse's eye temperature will be tested regularly, as was done in Yarnell's study that was associated with horses housing. So we can base our study off that study and use it to monitor the horses in the temporary stabling. And again, this will give us a physical indicator and provide owners and grooms with crucial indicators of how stressed the horse is or not. So I really hope this video has been informative and helped you to understand why we want to make these changes to temporary stabling at long format events. If there are any questions, then feel free to email me. I'll put my email at the bottom, and thank you for listening. As always, it's really appreciated.